So, welcome, a little bit late, and sorry for that, to the inaugural summit of the ISOP Israel and MOTHERISK International Drug Safety in the COVID era. So this is chaired by Professor Gideon Koren, that you have seen with a nice hat, his nice hat. And I am Irene Fromont, the chairman of ISOP Israel and founder. I am a physician and working in the drug safety and patient safety for, I don't remember when. So what is ISOP? ISOP is the International Society of Pharmacovigilance. It's composed of people from academy, from hospital, from industry, for governments, and we are just pushing to have better drug safety in the world. We have more than 700 members all over the world, and we have about 10 chapters. So the Israeli chapters have been created in 2013, and we have very high-level partners. First of all, MOTHERISK International today, we are doing this Bioforum who hosting us and supporting us for the beginning of ISOP Israel, people from hospital, from academy, from all over the world. And so what are we doing? We are, what we want to do is to have a better drug safety and to do it through research and through education. So for that, we need to have all the stakeholders. And the stakeholders, what we feel is that we cannot implement risk management in complex systems without having an integrated approach. So we want to have to be a platform for all the stakeholders and to have both to address all the field of drug safety and patient safety, especially patient education, community, hospital, and projects. So in our international advisory board, we have Professor Gideon Koren, who is the chairman today of this summit. He's the head pharmacology of the medical faculty in IL University. He's the founder of MOTHERISK International, first in Toronto, because all his career was in Toronto. We are very lucky that he came back to Israel and he has created MOTHERISK Israel. He's very well known for his 15 or more books that he has written on drug safety and on pregnancy, and he's also a singer, a composer, and he has written also theater for children. We have with us today Peter Pitt, who is really very busy, and thank you so much first for waiting and for being with us today. Peter Pitt is president of Center for Medicine in Public Interest and the founder. He was the FDA Associate Commissioner and is just advising Ministry of Health all over the world. So you can imagine that right now he's very busy. So in our advisory board, we have people from health policy and Professor Avelul, who is the president of SciAMS, and we have people who are really in the implementation field, like Nick Sevdalis and from UK, and Professor Littman from US. And now going back to our topic, with this new crisis that we have, that we are still in this crisis, we have really met a lot of challenges. First of all, we have to decide in emergency how to treat our patients, and this without having evidence-based medicine. So it was all the time it was a discussion between physicians and how to make a better validation of what we have decided to do. Do we use old drugs and or like chloroquine, or new drugs, or for which patients? older patients, pregnant patients, and at which stage of the disease, because it's a new virus, it's a new disease. At the beginning, it was a flu, and now it's we hear about cytokine storm, we hear about Kawasaki in the children. So it's every day we are learning something new, and we have not only to do things in emergency, but we have also to have a validation of our first hypothesis. We must treat people, but we need to be sure that it doesn't harm, and it's really we are really bringing a benefit. We had a lot of information, and we have to do a peer review and have very sound article, or do we have to throw all the information on the web? And so we had a lot of information, and we have to deal with this, of course, with artificial intelligence. And last but not least, for the government, we have to choose between health and economy and to make a balance, and this was really very difficult. So I'm very glad now to introduce Peter Pitt's talk, who has been in this crisis very busy. And Peter, please, you can share your screen.
I'm glad that we figured out the technology issues. Gidi, I love your hat. I need to buy one just like that. I'm glad to hear that there's a Canadian contingent here. I'm a McGill graduate. So, you know, in typical Canadian fashion, Canada is being represented by non-Canadians. So what I want to talk about today is a bit of an omnibus discussion on where are we globally and specifically in the US in terms of dealing with COVID-18. And the question, I think, to begin with is, are we behind the 8 ball? You know, is the virus winning? You know, are we making any progress from mitigating to containment? And I think that's a good question to ask. So how can we recapture the initiative? And I think there are a couple of ways to get there. The first is to understand the data. There's a lot of data out there. It's coming in at lightning speed. It's like drinking from an open fire hose. What are our strategies for the most at-risk populations, older people, people with respiratory conditions and other serious underlying healthcare conditions? What are our strategies for essential workers? And I think this goes beyond police officers, firefighters, medical professionals and hospital workers to teachers and students. They are clearly at risk. They are essential. And how do we deal with them in ways that are somewhat different, perhaps more aggressive than the general population? And then obviously the urgency of testing, both to measure the infection rates as well as post-measuring those with antibodies for a variety of reasons. I should mention that I'm sure that you're thinking that Donald Trump has said that if we only stopped testing, the infection rates would go down. And those of us in the public health business keep saying that whether you test or don't test, the infection rate is identical. It's simply a question of knowing versus not knowing. So unfortunately, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, in the US, this is becoming a political discussion, which certainly is unhelpful. So a couple of objectives for today's conversation. The first is to identify strategies and tactics, understand the value and validity of data, discuss the role of the individual relative to mitigation, focus on the power of collaboration, not just in terms of social distancing and wearing masks and personal hygiene, but collaborating globally from a public health perspective, from a professional perspective like this call today, and understanding the power of the healthcare ecosystem, which I think really is stepping up to help solve this problem. So what do the numbers tell us? Obviously, you have to separate the epidemiology from the media hype. Obviously, early in the pandemic in the US, the issue was deaths. Certainly here in New York, we didn't really understand how to deal with our older population, and the virus spread like wildfire through senior communities and retirement homes. Thousands, tens of thousands dead, a tremendous tragedy. Then we have to think about what's happening in hospital. How do we deal with people who are hospitalized from the virus? And the good news, and I'll get into this a little bit further on, is that in the US, we now understand a lot better how to make sure that when people check into the hospital with COVID-19, that they leave the hospital alive, a variety of reasons. And then, what about people that have had the virus and recovered at home? And I think you have to include in that population asymptomatic patients. Obviously, about 85% of all people who come down with COVID-19 are either asymptomatic or have symptoms that are controllable enough that they can ride it out at home in bed, drinking plenty of fluids and getting tender, loving care. So, even though we lump all these numbers together relative to infection rates, each case obviously is individual and different, and needs to be understood within its proper context. So how do we move from COVID being a deadly to a manageable disease? And I think obviously the first thing we've got to talk about is the value of therapeutics. Obviously the first question we all get all the time is, when will we see a vaccine? Well, that's not the first question I get in the US. The first question I get is, will an American company be the first to develop a vaccine? And my answer is, it doesn't make a difference. It's a completely useless question. What we want is a vaccine that can pass muster with the US FDA and go into manufacturing and get into patients as quickly as possible. Also, obviously, there's not going to be just one vaccine. There'll be multiple vaccines. And there'll be multiple vaccines for the general population, as well as there'll be a vaccine that's best for children. There'll be a vaccine that's safer for older people. So, when? I think we'll see a vaccine approved by the FDA probably in early 2021. And as you know, that's incredibly fast for a vaccine, but for Americans, it's not fast enough. And clearly, people want to know why it's taking so long. And the answer to that is science, but that's not the answer people want. And unfortunately, our political leadership here in the US is not helping. Is global cooperation truth or fiction? And certainly from a vaccine and from a therapeutics perspective, it's very much the truth. There are lots of studies going on all around the world, in Israel, in Europe, that are working on these situations. Now, unfortunately, as with science, you get answers that are contradictory. But again, think about this from a public communications issue. The last time most people touched science was when they were 17 years old. And at that point in time, there was a right answer and a wrong answer, very binary proposition. That's not what we're dealing with now. We're dealing with very sophisticated science. We're moving from the world of kind of the gold standard randomized controlled clinical trials to real world evidence and parallel trials. There's tremendous amounts of gray in the scientific conversation, tremendous amounts of nuance, and that's hard to communicate, but we've got to remember that it's important, because the truth really is in the margins. Regulatory control versus regulating the practice of medicine. Clearly, this is different from country to country, but generally speaking, when it comes to medicines licensing agencies such as EMA or FDA, there's the regulation of medicine that does not transcend into the regulating of the practice of medicine. And specifically, I want to talk about the use of medicines off-label to treat COVID-19. Obviously, dexamethasone and hydroxychloroquine at the top of that list at the moment. And then the danger of looking for a magic pill, looking for one magic solution that from one day to the next is going to completely solve the problem and we can all get back to life as normal. That only happens on television, where from one commercial break to another, the problem is solved and the couple gets married and everything is terrific. And that's not where we are right now. If only it was so simple. And then obviously the issue of drug shortages, whether it's a shortage of new therapeutics such as remdesivir, or shortages of hydroxychloroquine so that people who use it for example, lupus or rheumatoid arthritis can't get enough of it. Again, these aren't being discussed, but they're important public health issues. So where do you start? And I think that we start with the urgency of public education. Obviously explaining the basics of viral transmission. People simply don't understand how viruses work. They never have had to. And I think that ignorance in many respects speaks to the incredibly low rates of use of the annual flu vaccine here in the US. Embracing the tenets of personal responsibility. People have been used to, when it comes to healthcare issues, having things done for them in some magic way. Doctors take care of it, or hospitals take care of it, or the government takes care of it. And now, short of a vaccine, we're telling people, listen, you've got to do things, you've got to wear masks, you've got to keep your social distance, you've got to enhance your personal hygiene. And that is intruding on people's lifestyles. In the US, a lot of people are protesting that it is intruding on their personal liberties. And these things may be true or not, but quite frankly, from an epidemiological perspective, it's not relevant. We have to talk about herd immunity. We can look at the Swedish example, and in my opinion, and we can certainly discuss this, the Swedish example has just been a tremendous failure. You know, they are neither better nor worse off than anybody else, and lives could have been saved had they done it differently. This is just my opinion. And then specifically, and I think this is a uniquely American problem, although I'd like to hear what's happening in Israel, the urgency of masking. You know, Americans are doing a very, very bad job in terms of wearing masks. It's moved from a discussion of a good thing to do for the public health to a political conversation. If you like Donald Trump, you don't want to wear a mask. If you don't like if you do like Donald Trump, you wear a mask. It's extremely confusing and frustrating that the wearing or the not wearing of masks is a political statement in America. So what do we need to know? A lot of confusion out there, and unfortunately, the WHO has been unhelpful. Now, it's important that I say I don't believe that the US should leave the WHO, but there's a lot that needs to be fixed. So the first question is, do COVID-19 antibodies provide immunity? And the current science says, sort of, kind of, for a brief period of time. We also don't know whether or not when you get reinfected with COVID-19, whether you are contagious or as contagious the second time. Science is still out. We're collecting data. Very important things to know. What can we expect from COVID-19 2.0 come the cold weather in the US? And the answer is, again, we don't know. But it is a teaching moment for Americans, certainly relative to making sure that they get the flu vaccine even before there's a COVID-19 vaccine, because if you get the flu, your doctor's going to assume it's COVID-19. And if you have a flu shot, it's going to help diagnosis better. This is important relative to not testing people for things they do not need to be tested for. How can we incorporate regular testing into the general public health paradigm? Well, certainly as we reopen our economies, there are going to be requirements for enhanced testing to see whether a person is infected with the virus, whether those are on site, and whether they are instant tests or whether they're swabs remains to be seen. And so this is as much a public health question as it is a technology question. Clearly, more testing is better. And when it comes to testing, you've got quickness, quantity, and quality. There's no value in data if it is bad data. So we have to really address forcefully and continually the issue of false positives and false negatives. And clearly, this is more relevant relative to antibodies than it is for infection rates, but we need to keep it in mind, and we need to keep it in mind all the time. We need to make tests better on a continual basis. And then we need to ask ourselves, should vaccinations be mandatory? I don't know what the rule is in Israel. In some countries, many Asian countries, these types of vaccinations are absolutely mandatory. In the US, they are not. And again, it becomes as much a political as a public health question. I saw a poll the other day that said that 27% of Americans would not get vaccinated when a COVID-19 vaccine becomes available. That's an extremely frightening thing and kind of, I guess, loops back to the question of public education. And then once there is a vaccine and once it's manufactured to scale, who gets vaccinated first, second, third, and who makes those decisions? You know, is it a municipal decision? Is it a regional decision? Is it a national decision? A lot of that depends on the size of the country. Obviously, in Israel, you're a small country. You can mandate one set of rules for the whole country. In the US, it's far more complicated. And again, how should various levels of authority cooperate? And not just within a nation, but between nations. I think that needs to be done in a much better way. Clearly, you know, I do a lot of work all around the world. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Paris, Descartes Medical School, but I can't travel there. So international cooperation becomes incredibly important. And what about logistics? Beyond therapeutics, beyond a vaccine, we need to talk about ventilators, gowns, gloves, masks, hospital beds. How do we get these items from where they are to where they're needed? And again, not just on a national level, but internationally. And clearly, when it comes to issues like hospital beds and ventilators, oftentimes the answer isn't more of them, but getting people out of them and off of them quicker. And again, this speaks to the value of some interesting data on therapeutics. So I think we need to remember a couple of things. Firstly, the value of innovation. You know, minus cooperation between biopharmaceutical industry and academia and government institutions, nothing moves forward. You can't deal with COVID-19 with Band-Aids and aspirin. Secondly, the value of quality. We can't allow sub quality products to be put into motion here. That's only going to make things worse. The value of personal responsibility I've touched on. I can't stress it enough. Masking, social distancing, enhanced personal hygiene. And, you know, I do a lot of TV and radio interviews, and the first thing these people ask me is, you know, does washing your hands really make a difference? And you say, yes, it really does. And they look at you like you're an idiot, but you know, you can only do what you can do. And then again, lastly, this really speaks to the value of leadership. And I wish I could say that America was leading the world in solid political leadership on this issue. Alas, it is the reverse. In fact, today, our President Donald Trump said that hospitals should stop reporting incidences of COVID-19 to the CDC, and that rather they should report it directly to a new office inside the Office of Health and Human Services. So this is not good news for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is it will further deteriorate the faith of the American public in our public health institutions, which will also result, therefore, in fewer people wanting to get vaccinated once a vaccine works its way through the FDA. So not a lot of good news coming out of the US these days. So Irene, I have a message on my screen that says this meeting has been upgraded by the host and now includes unlimited minutes, but it also does not allow me to click out of it. Oh, there we go. Never mind.
So thanks so much, Peter. This was amazing and a very good start for this new series, which hoped to address therapeutic aspects of it, knowing that the whole world and their neighbors are talking on different things. I want to ask you a question or two. It seems that while you have really an extreme type of leadership, the complaints here are not very different, actually. And sitting back and looking whether I would have done it a bit better or other people that I know, and I'm not so sure. My question to you, the chaos, you mentioned main issues, but why do we have 80 studies on hydroxychloroquine, half of them reporting half results, confusing each other? Can we as a medical community leave out now all the other aspects and layers of society? Can we do better? And clearly, you rightly I agree with you about the WHO's performance. But can we do something different?
Well, firstly, on the issue of hydroxychloroquine, I think obviously it became a big issue initially because we were losing we were losing tens of thousands of patients in the hospital. And so what could we do? And clearly, and again, theoretically, some studies show that hydroxychloroquine given early and aggressively reduces lung infections, critically important. But again, as you said, the data is very back and forth. Personally, I think that the data on dexamethasone is more interesting. Same type of methodology of action relative to inflammation and gets people off of ventilators faster. So I think you're right. I think that we don't need to do as much. We don't need to spend as many hours and money on hydroxychloroquine as we have done to date. There's a large study coming out of England, out of the UK rather, to see whether or not it can be used as a preventative. So we'll see. So if that turns out to be positive, that's important. But I agree with you. It seems to be kind of the only issue being discussed. And I think largely that's because of Donald Trump, again, driving it from a political perspective. The WHO, God, that's another 5-hour conversation. I think firstly, they should keep their mouths shut until they're sure what they want to talk about. I'm all for sharing information in real time, but it seems to be doing more harm than good. And that's not a unusual WHO issue. So I think the answer to your question, Gidi, is, people are listening to WHO. It's viewed as an important authority. And when they say something, they better be 100% sure that's what they mean to say. So I think there's been some miscommunications that could have been handled better. I don't think there's any, but to that point, there's also no real global authority. If you ask yourself, where do you go to for the best information on COVID-19? I don't know what the answer is. It's not the U.S. It's not WHO. It's confusing. There's no real point of departure for everybody else.
Yeah, I'll talk about it in my part. The fiasco with Lancet taking back a study that presumably Harvard-based, but with data which was not very good, claiming more cardiovascular effects and death of hydroxychloroquine, causing a lot of studies to stop, only to be the study was taken off the record, and a lot of studies were renewed now. So here's an example, and of course Horton, the editor of Lancet, said that that's a fiasco, that we, instead of moving things forward, actually causing such a damage. So actually, I don't know. We never had anything like that in our memories. So I don't know if people have done better in other times, but I think a lot of it comes from, as you said, a lot of hysteria and but somehow I have a feeling that scientists and physicians lose their ability to do things better. Any other comments for Pete?
Well, so just quickly on 2 points. Firstly, that I think that the FDA, the U.S. FDA, issued an emergency use authorization for hydroxychloroquine, and they shouldn't have, and it's subsequently been withdrawn. The drug is still approved for use. Doctors can use it off-label as they see fit for their patients. That continues. So I think that was a mistake. And I don't know I can't say whether that was political. I'd like to say it's not, but it's done. And the second thing relative to the Lancet is what really surprised me relative to the retraction wasn't that the data was wrong, but that the data was simply not transparent. And I can't believe the Lancet would have published an article of that importance without having had access to the data. Shocking.
Of course, I just read a study showing that the time to accept a paper about COVID is about 1/3 of the time of a regular paper. So clearly not everyone, but a lot of people lose the critical aspects of our work, and that's scary. I hope those examples would lead it to it. Maybe, Irene, we can move forward.
So now it's you. Gidi, you are the next one. Professor Gideon Koren, founder and director of MOTHERISK International and MOTHERISK Israel. MOTHERISK was founded in Toronto. Gidi has written, is pediatrician and pharmacologist, has written 15 books and hundreds of articles, and he's also a singer, a poet, and a composer.
As Irene told you, my focus on academic therapeutics is drugs in pregnancy, and clearly here COVID-19 meets a lot of anxieties. First of all came the question whether COVID itself, when it occurs in a pregnant woman, would affect her terribly or her fetus. Until now, with the limited data we have from China and clearly from other countries, this does not seem to be the case. We don't know of more malformations, and we don't know of more other adverse events or maternal catastrophes. So in a way, this is better news than some other viruses, such as HIV, for example. But I want to kind of spend a couple of minutes about the therapeutic choices that are available now for COVID, and what does it mean if a pregnant woman takes it. The first we kind of mentioned already 5 or 10 times is the hydroxychloroquine. Luckily enough, hydroxychloroquine has been used for 3/4 of a decade, first for malaria and then for a large bunch of autoimmune diseases. So many women take it as part of life. So people like myself who counsel women and do research, there are a lot of studies on that issue. And the good news is that by and large, a large number of observational studies, you realize nothing is in pregnancies is double-blind or even RCT, and a large meta-analysis done by my colleague Cam Kaplan out of Izmir do not show increased overall risk for malformations. So this is good news. We needed that information, of course, for the woman with lupus, the woman with arthritis who needed it, and of course to the many women who have malaria that have been using the drug. But let's move now to something newer. Remdesivir, what do we know? It's a new antiviral. Clearly, it's not totally new, but it was not used clinically. And as expected, it will take time to collect cases in pregnancy. I just did today my last scan on it, and there are a couple of cases reported already in the literature as case reports of women's exposure in pregnancy. All they can say, I didn't see even one pregnancy outcome, but the pregnancies are going uneventfully till now. I will not be surprised very much if nothing big will come out of it. I know that Harvard Boston has started a new registry for people to send their cases, and that's maybe news you should scatter in your communities and attempt to collect all these cases when they happen. That will be very important. And the last drug I want to mention in a very few sentences is the dexamethasone, which clearly, as Peter said, it's not a newcomer, of course, in any ways of shape, but it does seem to do very well, and I will go through it when I talk about repurposing in my second talk. But clearly, it's here to stay for COVID. There's no question. This is important because dexamethasone has been used similar to many other corticosteroids in many other conditions in pregnancy. And we published a large meta-analysis showing that similar to animal studies, dexamethasone is associated with increased risk for oral cleft lip and cleft palate. So clearly, if the woman needs dexamethasone for COVID in the first trimester, this may result in increased risk for oral cleft lip, cleft palate. A relatively good news is that both, especially the lip, can be visualized, so one can go and see if that happened. And both are treatable, so they are not, for the most part, are not affecting brain development, and they are surgically treatable today in most centers that treat children. There's no question there will be more medication that come down, so people who have to address the complexity of mom taking a medication and baby may be affected will have to deal with those. Of course, as always when we deal with drugs in pregnancy, there's also the question of risk to the mother. And ethically, there's an overall consensus that you have to treat well the mother, because if mom is not doing well, it's very likely that the baby may not do well, and especially if we are talking severe cases. So I'm quite sure that the consensus that will be created will be similar to the dexamethasone. If mom is with severe case, with life-threatening aspects to it, or pulmonary failure that comes down, she should be treated, even if there is somewhat increased risk for oral cleft lip, cleft palate. I think I'll stop here my small presentation. Of course, if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, it will be a pleasure for me. Is Lee already online with us?
Yes, I am.
Hi.
Hi.
It's an extreme pleasure for me to introduce to you Lee Goldstein. Lee is a clinical pharmacologist. She is the head of the unit of clinical pharmacology in Emek Hospital in Afula, northern part of Israel, for those who are not from here. Even more relevant, she's the president of the Israeli Clinical Pharmacology Association. And back to the reason we are gathered today, Lee was, not surprisingly, more or less the facts to bring that issue up when the first conundrum came to our horizon, but what certain medications do, mostly in terms of the COVID itself, in terms of affecting COVID severity and seriousness. Lee was one of the first that brought us together, shared with us information. So I asked Lee to give us an overview, a bird eye overview about some of the examples that have occurred, and as important, how should we approach that issue? There are thousands of medications that women with COVID will take, either because they were on medications or people will try them. So Lee, tell us your take on this.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Just a minute. Okay, so thank you very much, Irene and Gidi, for inviting me to give this talk. And actually, the subject I was asked to talk about was, do drugs that are used regularly by patients affect the severity of COVID-19? Well, the quick answer to that is, I don't know. But even though that's the answer, or nonetheless, okay, how do I make this go forward? Just a minute. Nonetheless, a lot of discussion has been made during the past few months when we've been hit with this pandemia. We started talking about NSAIDs and then ACE inhibitors, and now lately it's proton pump inhibitors. And what about the immune modulators and immune suppression? What about that? And a lot of discussion about that, mainly because the public is involved in these discussions and are very uptight about things that we say and maybe shouldn't have said so quickly. I'll give an example that what happened in March. At the beginning of March, in a letter to the editor of The Lancet, these authors said that they took 3 retrospective studies with a total of 1,600 patients. I'll remind you that March, the pandemic just started in Europe, and we had a lot of information coming in from China. And there it was quite clear that people with hypertension and diabetes mellitus are, get this disease much worse. And these are risk factors associated with mortality and disease severity of the COVID-19 disease. None of these publications had anything to say about the medications that these patients were taking, but it stands to reason for these authors that wrote this letter, it stands to reason that they were probably on ACE inhibitors or ARBs, which is like standard therapy for people with hypertension and diabetes mellitus, let's say to prevent the renal, to prevent the effect on the kidneys. And then the theory was that the coronavirus, number one, and number two, bind to their target cells through the angiotensin converting enzyme receptor. And this receptor is expressed on the lung, the intestine, the kidney, and blood vessels. And the theory was that people who are on ACE inhibitors, we knew that, the expression of the ACE2 is upregulated, okay, because there's not enough angiotensin coming out, so the receptor is upregulated. It's also upregulated by ibuprofen, and so the hypothesis that these people proposed was that does treatment with ACE2 stimulating drugs, drugs that make this receptor upregulate, increase the risk of developing severe and fatal COVID-19. Now, it is true that hypothesis really generally generates research. But in this era, when everyone was hysterical, I think it's a good thing to say, hypothesis just generates facts. So people didn't, maybe started thinking about research, but before that, they already had the facts. And one French physician told somebody about 4 cases of severe COVID-19 and NSAIDs. It was never published and nobody really knew who this physician was and who he told. But the French minister, the French health minister heard of this and tweeted, this is a translation of what he tweeted, that taking anti-inflammatory drugs could be a factor in worsening the infection. So if you have fever, you would be preferred to take paracetamol. And then all havoc broke loose, I think. People started becoming really worried about NSAIDs. So the WHO and the FDA and the NICE issued, I think, half warnings because they didn't really know what to say because there was really no evidence. So the FDA on the 19th of March says, we are aware of new reports stating the use of non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. We are not aware of any scientific evidence, but you know, we're looking into it. So the FDA started looking into it, the WHO, the NICE started looking into it, and the WHO published a rapid systematic review in April of 2020, which concluded, and this review was of all the studies performed on all of the corona, the MERS and the SARS and the COVID-19 to see if there was any connection between NSAIDs and the severity of the disease or mortality or anything. And they actually found that there was nothing, you know, nothing, no signal of any problem. So I think William Shakespeare said, much ado about nothing, but that took a month. So the WHO, when they issued half warnings, a few weeks later, they actually reversed these half warnings, and all of this happened in 1 month. But the public became concerned about something new. They were concerned about the dangers of continuing ACE inhibitors and ARBs, and doctors even tended to recommend stopping them because of the concern that it would become, these patients would have a higher chance of contracting the COVID virus. And we all know of the deleterious effects of stopping ACE inhibitors, especially, let's say, in people who have congestive heart failure, when stopping the ACE inhibitor can be deleterious for these patients. So this is a nice, actually, diagram that I took from the New England showing that there are two sides of this coin. The one side is saying that if the ACE receptor is upregulated, okay, because the patient is on ACE inhibitors, you would have more receptors for the coronavirus. The virus connects to this receptor and is internalized. As a result of this, there are less receptors. Okay, there's less ACE2 receptors. Now, if a patient is not on ACE inhibitors, okay, and he has a normal angiotensin 2, now this angiotensin 2 is pro-inflammatory, and it's usually counteracted by the presence of this receptor. Now, so there are 2 points of this, there are 2 sides of this coin. The one side, they're having this ACE receptor makes it more, it makes the COVID virus, that's where the COVID virus enters. On the other hand, so having ACE inhibitors is not good. On the other hand, if you are on an ACE inhibitor, you will have less angiotensin 2, and if you already got the COVID, if you already got the coronavirus, you will now have a pro-inflammatory effect of this angiotensin, which has no receptor waiting for to counter its effect. So there's actually, it might be good and it might be bad to take ACE inhibitors or ARBs. And this was an article published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they tested this. And their objective was to assess the relation between any treatment, any hypertensive treatment with ACE inhibitors, ARBs, beta blockers, calcium channel blockers, or diuretics, and see if any of these would be connected to a positive result on COVID-19 testing, or would they be connected to the likelihood of a severe illness. So they had 12,000 patients, over 12,000 patients in a large healthcare network in New York City who were positive for COVID-19, who were tested for COVID-19. Almost 50% of these were positive, and 30% of these people had hypertension. Even more of these that had hypertension were positive for COVID-19. But in all of their assessments and analysis, there was no increase in the likelihood of a positive test for COVID-19. There was no increase in the risk of severe COVID-19 in association with any of these hypertensive medications. And in another meta-analysis that was published in the American Journal of Cardiology recently, they included 8 studies with a total of 62,000 patients. 20,000 of them were ACE and ARB users, and another 42,000 were non-users. And they tested the odds of testing positive for COVID-19, and you can see that is no difference with people who are taking ACE inhibitors and people taking ARBs. There was no association between the likelihood of testing positive for COVID-19 and using ACEs or ARBs. There was also no difference in mortality in people taking ACEs or ARBs. So I think that probably the ACE and the ARB business we can probably put behind us, I think. But we have a new issue, which is probably, I think, more, it seems to me, maybe a bit more correct. People started checking, do proton pump inhibitors possibly endanger patients with COVID-19? Because we all know how proton pump inhibitors with people with chronic use of proton pump inhibitors do have increased odds for enteric infection. We know that it can also cause lung infections, more pneumonia. We know a lot of patients are taking proton pump inhibitors totally with no actual indication at all. And all of this is due to the fact that the hypochlorhydria, which is induced by the proton pump inhibitors, is said to maybe impair the body's defense against bacteria and viruses which we ingest. We also know that a very, very acidic pH of less than 3 impairs the infectivity of the coronavirus. And by increasing the stomach pH by using proton pump inhibitors, we might actually allow the coronavirus to gain entry into the gastrointestinal tract more easily. So their hypothesis was that the proton pump inhibitors may actually increase the risk of acquiring COVID-19. So they did a population-based online national health survey. They didn't tell people what they were looking for, and they sent out this survey to 250,000 individuals, and 86,000 completed the survey. Of them, about 61% noticed that they had prior GERD symptoms, which will obviously mean that they were at risk for taking proton pump inhibitors. And 6% of these reported that they had tested positive for COVID-19. Now, if you think of the odds, if you look at the odds of a patient having a positive COVID-19 test with patients who were not on proton pump inhibitors or on proton pump inhibitors once a day or twice a day, you can see that patients on proton pump inhibitors once a day had a 2-fold chance of testing positive for COVID-19, and twice daily had an almost 4-fold chance of testing positive, which was not true for H2 blockers. Not true. And this is another article which hypothesized that possibly patients on proton pump inhibitors would have more secondary lung infections and possibly more ARDS. And that is because we know that proton pump inhibitors can actually cause pneumonia, or at least enlarge the risk for pneumonia. In a total, they had 152 patients, which were hospitalized patients, okay, so they were obviously the more severe patients with coronavirus infection. And they had a retrospective analysis. They did say that approximately 30% of these patients had no indication for taking proton pump inhibitors, but they were taking them anyway. And you can see that the patients that were taking proton pump inhibitors, they were different from the non-users, okay? So they had more comorbidities, they had more coronary heart disease, more congestive heart failure, more renal disease. But if you look at their outcome, you can see that they did have more secondary infections, they were more prone to develop ARDS, and they had higher mortality. And when they did a multivariate analysis of all of this, they found that proton pump inhibitor treatment still remains significant, with a significant predictive factor for the development of secondary infection, okay, more than doubled the risk of secondary infection, and also gastrointestinal reflux disease also was a risk factor for secondary infection, even a stronger risk factor. So I think that proton pump inhibitors are probably we're getting a more convincing facts there. Now, what do we tell patients that are on immunosuppression and on immune modulation? I often have been asked what to tell these patients. Should they go back? Should they, should they go to their workplace? Should they stay away from work? Are they at any risk? Well, the truth is that at this stage, I think all of us doctors can just use common sense. I don't think we have much more facts of this, but so people who are taking bone marrow suppression, such as chemotherapy and radiotherapy, stands to reason that they will be at enlarged risk for COVID-19, I think. Also, medications that are associated with lymphopenia, which, as you know, lymphopenia itself is associated with COVID severity, so you could maybe think that these medications would also be associated with COVID severity. Now, what about immune checkpoint inhibition, which we know that immune checkpoint inhibition actually stimulates the immune system. We also know that the COVID-19, when it complicates, can cause a cytokine storm and a lot of autoimmune manifestations, which that is actually what causes the death of the patients. So probably giving a person an immune checkpoint inhibition, which would make this even worse, it probably is not advisable. So I think that it would be safe to say that if your patient can possibly postpone his treatment, and certainly not take treatment when he's actually ill, it would probably be good advice. Systemic steroids, we already spoke about them, that there's more and more evidence. At the beginning, the WHO said, don't use them unless you really think it's necessary, but now, if there's different other reasons for using it. But now I think more and more evidence has come out that that severe patients do benefit from treatment. There's not much to say, and I don't know about methotrexate or azathioprine or anti-TNF. But anti-IL-23, maybe that's good. With a cytokine storm, we know that the IL-23 is high and the IL-6 is high. So maybe patients on these medications, maybe it's actually good even to be on these medications. We don't know, but you could think that it might be a good thing. And tocilizumab maybe too, Actemra. We even ourselves have given Actemra for patients having a cytokine storm because of their high IL-6, and it does seem to help, although I know that studies are controversial about that. So in summary, I would say that COVID-19 is an evolving disease. There are much more questions than answers. The literature is swamped with publications. Not all are peer-reviewed. When I say literature, it's the medical literature and also, the lay literature of that any person can read. It seems that anything and everything is published, and published in good, journals that we used to trust, like the New England, like the Lancet, and that publications that would never been published in journals like this are now being published. Many of these publications reach the media, and they are uncensored and influence patients and doctors and causing possibly unnecessary concern. And us doctors, I think, should keep to evidence-based medicine and try as much as we can to really wait for the evidence before making decisions and before stopping medications that are patients doing well on their chronic medications. I think we should, to wait for the evidence before making any decisions.
Thanks so much, Lee. This was really fantastic. Of course, comments. I know what comes to my mind is, of course, that with so many exposures in millions of patients, this is the best for the new AI approaches. Maybe Gidi can even later on relate to it, to use large databases, because now, as you said, it's looking at drug A and B, but we have 3,000 drugs out there, and it will make much more sense to do it in using machine learning and really good techniques of looking at that. But I think your last sentence was the very resonant d'etre for us to do these meetings, is evidence-based. It's to go to evidence-based. Any other comments?
I think that today, to know what is evidence-based medicine, I think it's really a challenge, because as you tell us, we have so contradictory articles in very renowned journals that I think that it's a very difficult point. And perhaps we have to, as a group, we have to come with analysis of the literature and come like we are doing today with some analysis and say, this is a serious article, this is not a serious. And of course, we cannot avoid the fact that it's used by media, public media, and this is our time.
I think that maybe the end of my sentence should have been used evidence-based medicine, and probably in brackets I should have said and common sense at this moment.
Yes.
I think the trauma that happened to Lancet and now New England retracting another paper by the same group, I think will lead them to be at least post-traumatic, trying to say, hey guys, it's not just about being in the USA Today. It's about really helping people, and that's not very helpful. Other comments?
Do we have to stop non-peer review articles, or because this is also the problem? Do we have to give very quickly all the data that we have, or do we have to take some time? Perhaps it's now we have now perhaps a little bit more time, but could we go back to peer review, even if it's a fast peer review? What do you think?
It's interesting. The first Oxford, the big Oxford study that was stopped midway with the dexamethasone, I actually liked it that their steering committee instructed them to publish an abstract, not in any meeting, of course, but just to give the facts and how they decided to stop, the preliminary statistics showing the advantages. And they said, we are now writing the paper to submit it. So on the one hand, they were even, they were not telling you any, they didn't talk like dramatically about it, but they created a new venue for communication, but they said we'll have to wait the peer review.
This was one of the questions, how to escape from this spurious literature flood.
Yeah, we have Peter.
I think it also speaks to the need to communicate early findings, but keep them in the proper perspective. I think to date, people have thought that if an article appears in the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet, it has gone through all the peer review that we expect it to. And that simply is not the case. So how do we communicate the fact that new data is preliminary and needs to be taken in the proper context?
Do you see now my slides?
Yes.
Oh,
yes.
Fantastic. You see? You can teach even old dogs new tricks.
Of course, we can learn all the time.
Okay, so I'm going to talk very briefly. I must tell you, I'm teaching medical students clinical pharmacology, and I thought to teach them about repurposing, I'll take the corona. So it made it valuable for them. And those who know me already, we finished that, and the paper is already in press in a journal of medical education. So let's see how I move it. I'm not sure I know how to.
You have to, yes. You have to.
Well, repurposing. Yeah, it's okay. Repurposing, of course, is using existing drugs for new indications, different from those originally thought. This can be a drug that is already on the market, or a drug that failed in the past to enter the market, but it's on the shelf of a drug company. I thought I'll give the example, one or two examples that really show dramatically how it worked well for mankind. The bupropion I like very much. This was introduced for depression in the 80s, was not a great drug, didn't do great, but was approved. And against placebo, it had clearly a good effect. But interestingly enough, during phase 3 trials, the company, one of the largest companies in the world, noticed that these depressed patients who have a tendency to smoke much more decrease their urge for smoking and high long-term abstinence rate. So here's the cue was a clinical observation during clinical trial, during phase 3. This is fantastic luck, of course. And about 14 years after the bupropion as Wellbutrin for depression, it was introduced again by the same company as Zyban as the first oral way to deal with smoking. And it's, of course, a multi-billion winner. It has its own issues, of course, but that's true for every drug. It decreased the threshold for seizures, for example. Another great example that come up everywhere is, of course, the Viagra story that started as a drug for hypertension and angina and was found again during clinical trials to do something else very pleasant and became a multi-billion profit maker. And there are many other examples. How about corona? Here we are, and of course, it makes sense that if it's a virus, we should look at antiviral drugs. But is there already data out there that can help us? I chose, for obvious reasons, the hydroxychloroquine. The reason I did it, first of all, it was the first drug that early 2020s became to accumulate clinical evidence. But importantly enough, it's now for quite some time that we know that chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine inhibit replication of the COVID viruses. And those studies, by nature of the way they are done, even decided or could decide the 50% effective concentrations, as we do with every dose response curve. This was published about 11 years ago. So the question is, can you create those type of levels in the blood of people? Would this be a totally new drug? We will have to go through phase 1, phase 2, but hydroxychloroquine has been used for malaria for the longest time. And just for the exercise with my students, I sent them to find studies, and there were studies that patients received it for malaria, and you could calculate the concentrations achieved when it's used for malaria. The point being that those doses are already approved by FDA and other for malaria, so it makes the road much shorter. And then, of course, that should shorten the time for phase 1. Phase 1 is the phase where we give us escalating doses, and once we get to serious side effects, we decrease it. Alas, this does not work for chronic side effects, and I'm sure Gidi Stein may talk about it more. But it's a starting point. It's a starting point. Phase 2, of course, is a phase where we do the kinetics. We want to see if we can create those levels with a level of drug which was achieved in phase 1. In the case of the hydroxychloroquine, because there are quite a few studies on malaria, one could shorten this time period, or know at least that we are in the game, quote unquote. Phase 3, of course, known to all of us, the penultimate standard, when it's done randomized, hopefully even blinded, if possible. I won't go into it. All of you are in this business, and you have to deal with a lot. To do the right RCT is not a small thing. It's not a small thing. It's much easier to publish a case series and make claims. So what's the emerging evidence? There are now over 80 trials registered for hydroxychloroquine. 80 different trials. And there are contradictory results. I won't go into it just because of time. We started late. A large Oxford study did not show effectiveness. There were studies that claimed effectiveness. But of course, the event I alluded to earlier is when the Lancet paper claiming, based on very large numbers, that there's increased number of deaths associated with the use of hydroxychloroquine for COVID-19, that of course was a bombshell. Actually, it caused a lot of these 80 studies to halt or stop because their safety committees and hospitals and ethics committees could not, IRBs could not allow it to continue. But then this paper was retracted. It was retracted actually not to small part by work by journalists, actually British journalists, who asked a lot of questions and could not get answers. And of course it was retracted. A New England paper by the same group on another aspect was also retracted. And if you look at the NIH COVID-19 treatment panel, they clearly say they recommend against the use of hydroxychloroquine plus or minus alvetro, except in a clinical trial. And of course, except for patients who take it for known indications, such as rheumatic diseases and so on and so forth. I just want to touch what I talked very briefly before, is the dexamethasone study. This is the recovery trial from Oxford University. On June 8th, we're talking a month ago, the trial was halted, recruitment, after more than 4,000 randomized patients. They had dexamethasone, either oral or IV, versus standard care alone at the time of as based in the hospitals where these patients were. And of course the results were quite dramatic. Dexamethasone reduced the death of a third of the ventilated patients. That's serious, very serious. And to a less extent, but still significant, by patients who were not ventilated, but received oxygen only. So clearly with some respiratory failure. So as I said, these guys, to the best of my knowledge as of today, have not published the paper. Maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. But they issued a summary, kind of an abstract, an enlarged abstract, also mentioning that it was their steering committee that instructed them to do that. And of course, we are all awaiting the paper to come out. But I think we'll see much more events of that nature related to adverse events. Here we'll have it with the evidence itself. And I think what I read into it is I have to read it very carefully. I have to synthesize that data to decide for myself if I agree with it. And of course, I think we have to do everything possible to get away from the dramatic, from the show business part of it. In some American journals, admittedly, and I know it because I publish a lot, such as JAMA New England, the joke is that they are interested not just in the impact of the paper scientifically, but also in the USA Today impact factor. Will they be quoted and brought to TV stations? I hope we can establish new norm that we as a medical and scientific committee do not participate in this kind of fallacy. I'll stop here.
Just one quick question. Great slides, by the way. A quick question on the USA Today comment that you made. I think the bad news is that it's going in the other direction. That researchers and publications, rather than turning down the volume, are increasing their appetite for these types of appearances. And unfortunately, in the mainstream media, as you all know, when the media asks you a question, you can't say, well, it's complicated. Can you give me 20 minutes to answer your question? You know, they want an answer in 30 seconds, and that does not help dial down the hype.
But you know, Peter, maybe this is the time for the medical community to be again proactive. You remember the days when the committee of editors decided that if you don't register your trial, we will not publish it later, because a lot of pharma used to hide negative results. And the disclosure and the continuous follow-up told us that there is another study. Maybe it's the right time somehow to get the voice out that we need to do something about that. Because it's life-threatening.
Yeah, maybe the COVID-19 pandemic is an opportunity. I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
But, in Europe, we have a registry of all the clinical trials, and it's mandatory to have the clinical trial registered in this public registry. I suppose the same in US, no?
You know, what's interesting is both in Europe and the US, the biopharmaceutical industry is very good about registering its trials. Academia is very bad at registering its trials.
That's right. Yeah, but still, if it's a large study that can change dramatically effect, everyone knows that if you don't register, you won't get it into the tier 1 journals, you know. And it just won't happen. Any other questions?
Yes, I wanted to ask a question, Gidi. You say that the NIH has recommended again to use chloroquine, but except in clinical trial. What does it mean?
Well, if you register the clinical trial, that has an arm on hydroxychloroquine, they do not tell you to stop it, because it's with the hope and understanding that you do it according to the rules. If it's a phase 3, you do it accordingly. And of course, these should continue. None of us tell people not to do the studies. We just say, don't advertise a drug or tell people to drink bleach because the president said so. We have to do everything possible for us as a medical community to be based, and as Lee said in her presentation, on evidence-based to the same rigor we had it before the corona. Mm-hmm. Unless we claim that the corona caused encephalopathy in many of our medical leaderships.
Excuse me, please. May I interrupt? Our time is...
A question. Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
My question is it possible the discrepancies we have in this drug has a lot to do with how the clinical trials were designed? Because it can make a whole lot of difference in the outcome of some of these discrepancies.
Well, if it's a randomized trial with a good, with very good control, steering committee and adverse events committee and good statistics, you cannot really do much if it's a randomized trial or controlled trial. Of course, the more observational the study is, there are more confounders. And then, of course, I have to admit, you are more prone for people to find what they want to find. Because we all know that once it's observational studies, depends how much confounders you have, how much data you have on them, and how much controls. So your question is extremely important. The studies must be designed in a way that we will believe it scientifically. And in our case, because it's a medication compared to another one, or 2 to another one. It has to be, in most cases, randomized controlled trials, hopefully blinded even, if possible. Because otherwise, yes, observational studies or poorly designed collection of data are much more prone to bias.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think we'll move on. We left for the last, the best actually. Gidi Stein is a physician and the CEO of MedAware. It's a company Israeli-based, but he is not just an Israeli leader, he's a world leader in finding solutions for medication errors with amazing technology that he and his group developed. And he kind of was asked by us to talk about AI, artificial intelligence solutions to prevent medication errors. Gidi. Yes,
Green MedAware screen. Good.
we do, very well.
Good. Okay, so really thank you for providing me with the opportunity to talk with you today. Before I start, I would like to refer to some of the comments that were made, I think, by Lee or you, Gidi, regarding the use of AI in the COVID pandemic. So, you know, AI is a nice buzzword and also a very useful and good tool, but it's only as good as the data that we have. So, I mean, it doesn't make miracles. So in order for the AI to perform and provide value, we basically need to have a lot of data that we can learn from. And apparently in COVID situation, there's not a lot of data out there because it's an evolving process, and data from 2 months ago may be irrelevant today. So there are a lot of attempts around the imaging and around maybe epidemiology, but around medications, it's a bit problematic because we really have no clue what works and what doesn't work, only some clues and hints regarding steroids and anti-inflammatory response and maybe the anticoagulation in some other reports. But one thing that COVID did change dramatically is the way that we treat the non-COVID patients. Because if until a few months ago, most of the complex patients basically visit their specialists and physicians and the ER quite frequently just to make sure that they are managed well. Today, these patients are kept out of the hospital and out of the arm reach of their clinicians and care coordinators and nurses and what have you, simply because they are complex, they are high risk of catching COVID. And this led to a change in how we treat the patients and expose them to a substantial risk in terms of follow-up, of monitoring, and of and basic management. Because when we come to the physician's office, we're greeted by a nurse, takes our vitals, takes our history, medication reconciliation, a huge process, and then goes into the family physician or specialist. Now more and more is going into telehealth encounters, which are short, not well organized in most cases. Physicians don't have a full picture of the patient profile when they are prescribing and when they are managing these patients, especially the complex ones with comorbidities and multiple medications. So this becomes